Today I will show you how to build a web application in JavaScript using a framework called Hyperapp. So what's so special about this framework? It's only 1 kilobyte in size. It's like favicon. The framework is so small that it fits a slide, which is kind of funny. Because it's so small, you have just few concepts you need to learn. So there is a view, action, effect, and subscription. And if you know those concepts, you can build almost any application you want. I find this framework brilliant. I mean, the author is brilliant to come up with something like that. And I wanted to share it with you. I'll be talking fast because there's a lot of things to cover. So the framework is declarative. It's very similar, if not identical, in the idea to React.js and any other things that are inspired by React. If you want to use it, if you want to use Hyperapp, you don't need to install anything. You don't need to use any bundler. You can just open your editor, write some HTML, add JavaScript, and it works. Simplicity at its finest. Framework is functional, so you create your applications by composing functions. This leads to some very interesting results. Using Hyperapp reminds me of playing with Lego. So Lego is extremely simple, but yet you can build so many beautiful things with Lego, and the pieces are the same. There's just one way of connecting those pieces. And many other companies were trying to come up with something as simple as Lego, but I think Lego is winning here. I've been saying simple a lot recently in other videos and in articles I've been writing. So when I say simple, simple doesn't mean easy. So there's a distinction. Simple is usually more difficult at the beginning, at least. But in the long run, you see the benefits. And easy is, approachable at the beginning, but then you start to see certain quirks with easy solutions. So a good example of that would be JSX. JSX, the idea is to be familiar, to be easily understood, and to mimic the HTML. But under the hood, it's just JavaScript. The functions are being invoked. JSX has some quirks. Then it's, some people like it, some other people don't like it. And simple goes into this other direction that you have the syntax, which is, at the beginning may look complicated, but then you will start to see benefits. Mostly because it's just JavaScript, it just functions, and you can just compose them anyway, in any manner you want. Like, Lego. And to finish off, just a few quotes. Edgar Dijkstra, simplicity is a prerequisite for reliability. And the one attributed to Da Vinci, but apparently he hasn't said that. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. We will build this little application here, and it's based on the official Hyperapp tutorial. I just tweaked some things and changed the styling. So if you want to follow up, you can watch this tutorial, of course, but if you don't understand certain things, you can always go to the tutorial and read about this. Because as I said, I want to be very quick here, create a very short video. So we have this app. We can select, it's a list of innovative JavaScript frameworks, mostly objective, with one exception here, which is highly subjective. And you can click, you can see which one you already seen, which yet you need to see, and then you have description. And then you also have a search bar. So if you, for example, type something, it fetches only those that match the query. So let's build that. You don't need to install anything. You just need HTML, so index.html. It's a very simple structure. We have HTML head and body. In the head section, we have the style sheet, the one I created, so you can just reference that remotely. You don't need to create styles. Then you need a script to use it. Well, I think it would be better to add it here. And the node to which we will be attaching our application. And that's all. And then we have app, which is empty for now. And the other thing we need is to serve this HTML on a port. So there are many ways to do this. I've been using a tool called Serve. You can install it with npm. But if you don't want to install anything, Python is, for example, built into on macOS, and there's a built-in HTTP server into Python, so you can run it like that from the command line. And once you run it, if you go to port 5000, you are serving this little this HTML. So if I change it, I say hello world and refresh it, it appears. But let's create a Hyperapp. So let's go to the, if I refresh, it disappears. So here we need to import three things: function h, the function app, and text. And we will be importing that from a remote location. So from unpackage Hyperapp. So we don't need to install Hyperapp, we can just do it like that. And in order to create an application in Hyper, we just need to invoke the app, and we need to provide three things: the init state, the view, and node. And that's all. So init, at the beginning, it will be empty. The node will be just the element we have in HTML, the app element. So we will be getting it by ID, like that. And then we have the view. So view is a function. And let's start with something simple. So you create your app. So you have this function called h, which creates virtual nodes. And these are plain objects, plain JavaScript objects that represent DOM nodes. So I can say, for example, h1. The second argument, the first argument is the name of a tag, for example, h1. The second one is the list of attributes. And the third one is the content. So for example, hello world. And this corresponds to saying h1 hello world, right? It's just using the JavaScript instead of HTML. So if I save that and refresh the app, it appears. And now let's do something different. So we have this h1, and let's say we want to have the word world bolded like that. So we want to nest two tags. So in Hyper, the third argument is where you are doing where you nest things. So we will remove that, and here we will put array, and inside the array we will say that the first word hello is the normal text, and the second argument of this array is the tag strong with no attributes and the text world. And if I refresh, it works. So this way we are creating apps just by using the h function for creating the nodes and by nesting those invocations. So that may at the beginning sound strange for many, but let's see what we can do with that. So instead of creating the structure from scratch, I will just paste a static structure like that, which corresponds to the application we are building. So let's quickly analyze that. We are creating diff. Inside the diff we have three other diffs, and inside those diffs we have, for example, a list here. Here we have the content of element, and here we have a filter. And if I refresh, I have this static structure. I cannot do anything here. And this is the representation. So it doesn't look great, but let's improve that. So the first thing we notice is that we have this repetition here. So we're repeating those two elements. We are repeating the markup. We are creating the same, let's say, nodes. So let's extract that. So the first one is unread, which is blue, and the second one is reading, which is selected and yellow or orange. So let's extract that quickly. I will just create a function called project. So it's something like a component, and I will paste it here. And now here in the list, instead of repeating the whole markup, I can just say project, right? So like components in React. But I lost this information about what's the current one. So let's fix that. So instead of doing it in a static way, let's parameterize that. So we need a few things. We have a title, pitch, author. So let's use that. And then we need an information about if it's read or unread. So unread and currently reading. So in Hyper you have this convention that if you specify the class as a object instead of string, and you pass booleans, it will attach the proper name. So if the reading is true, the class will be reading, and if it's unread true, the class will be unread. In the title, we will just say text title, and here we will say text page, and here author. So now below I can parameterize that. So I can say title, let's say title 1, pitch 1, outer 1, let's say unread will be true, and reading will be false. Now we copy that, remove this one, and we will just change, and we will say false and true here. So now if I refresh, it works as before. So we extracted this common thing into a function, into a component, which is very similar to React. But let's go further. Let's try to improve it even more. So now we have this list here, and let's extract it to a component as well. So we will create another function called project list, like that, and we will copy those 2 lines here. And now the entry for this will be the list of projects. So we don't know yet how we will represent that, but this will be a hash. The projects will be a hash of ID and the project. So let's iterate over it using just JavaScript. So projects, and then this will give us, the keys will give us the ID of each project. I can just say project, and I can say title, and this will be projects, project, and title. And the same will go for pitch, and what we have else, author. So this will be the same. And we have this unread field as well. So this will be projects, project unread. And let's also pass the element that we are currently reading to be able to select that. So we will say if reading is project, and now we can replace this piece over here with just project list, like that. But we need to provide the list of projects, so we can just projects, and this will be 1, and we will have title and author, and then we will have unread false. And if I repeat that, let's say something like that. So I'm just passing the data directly to project list, which goes over that, extracts the ID, and then gets the proper values and creates the project, which is this component over here. So if I refresh, it doesn't work. Okay, so I need to specify the reading, currently being the element that is currently being read. So let's say the first story. Okay, so here it returns array already, so I cannot nest it like that, and it works. So it looks slightly better, but not ideal. But let's go further, and let's, for example, extract this filter. So let's create a component or a function which will contain this part over here. And here we will just invoke it. And let's do the same for the, so this part, let's extract it to a component, and let's call it project content. Like that, and let's paste it here. So if I save, nothing should change, but there is this problem that we are passing the static data directly to our component, which is not ideal. We could improve that. So we have this init parameter, which is the initial state of our application. So let's go ahead and put that into our initial state. So I'll just grab this whole data, and here I will just use it as the state of our application, like that. So we have the central place for the state. And now we can just access this state in Vue, because the first parameter of the Vue is state. So we can just say state, like that. So if I refresh, it still works. So we still have this div container. Maybe we could extract it to let's build from the Lego a slightly bigger piece, so it's more descriptive. And let's call it a container simply, and we will just grab this part, and it will be taking content, and it will be putting content here, like that. So now I can just say container. It starts to look descriptive. So now we see that we have the container component with 3 components inside, like in React. So now let's also pass the state to the project content. So it reflects the project content is still static. Let's make it slightly more dynamic. So in the content, we need just access the title, the pitch, and the author. So here we will use the title, here we will use the pitch, and here we will use the author. So if I save, it's undefined because in state we want to access only the project we are currently reading. So we will just get the reading property from the state, which is 1, and find it in the projects to get a specific project. So this way it should display this really projects, of course. Yeah, so it displays 1, 1, and if I change now the state to 2, it displays 2, 2. It's still static. Now the state is flowing from one place. Let's improve our filter. The filter is static inside the component, so let's put it in our state. And let's say it's the word pitch, for example. Well, let's create a function that will highlight a word in a title and or in a pitch section. So for example, let's call it emphasize, and it will be taking a word and a string, and we will just get the string, we will split it into words, we will map over those words, and if the word is equal to the one provided, in that case we will return it highlighted, so like that, or otherwise we will just return the word as it was. And to make it a little bit more practical, we can just convert lowercase to be sure that we are always comparing, in this case, insensitive, like that. Then in the project, I can just say emphasize for each, for those two, and we need a filter here, and we need to pass the filter here as well. So we need to pass it here, and we need to pass it from the state. Now, as you can see, it's highlighted, it's bold. So if I change the filter to something else, like let's say 11, it will only highlight those two. So the filter works, but it's still static. So let's make it dynamic. For that, we need actions. The first action we would need is to distinguish between editing this field over here. So when I click the button, I should be able to enter the text, and then when I confirm, I should have the filter applied to the list. In Hyper, effects are just functions, like everything else. That's the beauty of it. So we will just create a start editing filter, and they take state as the input, and they return state as the output. So if you know Redux or something like that, it's very similar. And what we will do here is that we will return the state as before, except a new field called editing filter, which will be true. So we will have a field in the state that will say if this field is currently being edited or not. Complement that, we will have a stop editing filter, where we'll be changing the state to false. So now we can use those two actions. In our filter component, we can now distinguish between the fact that we are editing or not. So we are getting this editing filter as the parameter. So we are passing the state. And now we can just say editing filter. If it's true, in that case, I should have input of type text and value filter. So this will be otherwise it will be just filter. And the same for the button. So we'll be changing the button. If it's true, we will have one button, and if it's false, we will have another one. So if I save, so we now have this filter being passed to this component correctly, but nothing happens when I click, because we need to connect the action. So on a click, we will execute one of those actions we create. So if editing filter is true, we need to invoke stop editing filter, and if it's false, we need to execute start editing filter. Let's save, let's refresh. So now if I click, as you can see, if it's true, I have input and different icon, and if it's false, it seems to work. pretty easy, and we are just using functions. We're composing functions. So now when someone enters something here and confirms, let's apply that to our state, to our filter. So we need another action. Let's call it set filter. And again, it takes states and transforms the states. So that filter is something, but how can we get this information? Well, this is the input of this field. So we can pass a second argument, the event that happens. We can say event target value, like that. And now we can just connect it. Here in the input, when someone provides that, we will just use this action, and it will get as a second argument the value that was entered into that field for the event. So event target is this input and its value, and the value is this value that it's currently set, and that's how we access that. So now if I change it, if I say something like pitch, it reflects. If I say title, so it works. So now let's fix the selecting of a story. So when I click, I should have the proper story being selected. So we need another action here. So this will be select project. We'll be getting the ID. And now we just say that currently we are reading this ID. So now in the project, we just need to attach this on click to this select project action. But we also need to pass the ID. So we need to know which ID it is. So I'll be passing this ID here. When I'm iterating over projects, I'm getting IDs. So maybe I should rename it to ID like that. So it's more. And then I'm passing this to this component, so I know which ID it is. I'm accessing it here. And then I can pass this parameter to the action using this syntax. So I need to wrap it into an array, and this means that when onClick happens, invoke this function and pass the ID as the second argument, because the first argument of actions is always the state, and that should be enough. So if I refresh and I click, changes. Pretty nice. Okay, so we are almost there. Now it'd be nice to, instead of using the static data, use dynamic data and to fetch it over the wire from a remote location. So I prepared a URL which contains the projects as JSON, and let's try to connect to this endpoint. So if you go to fipzais.net/projects, you will see this list, and we will now try to fetch that. First thing, we need another action. Once we receive this data, we need to transform it into our state over here. So let me just paste, because it's a more elaborate action, and I will explain it. So the action is called got_projects, and it transforms our state. So it leaves the previous state as it was, and then it goes over the second parameter. It maps over this collection, because here we have a collection of elements. So it's an array, and then we have hashes, and we are just transforming it in a way that we are getting the ID, and through reduce, we are transforming it into this shape. So this is a hash where the ID is outside. It looks scary, but the only thing it does, it just takes the ID, puts it outside, and creates an object from an array where the ID is the key and the whole object is the value. We somehow normalize this data so it's useful for our application, because our application expects this shape and the endpoint just returns a collection array. So once we have that, we need a way to fetch it. Up till now, we've been talking about views, which are components, and actions that transform the state of our application. But now we need an effect to fetch. So the first thing we would do is that we need a function that just executes the query. So we can use the built-in fetch API in the browser. We get the URL from options we will be passing. And then there is a special function that's being inserted by the Hyperapp framework called dispatch that allows us to do something once we finish with the processing. So here we are executing the query, we are getting the response, we are transforming the response into JSON. And once we have the JSON, we can invoke our function to notify our application that the state should be updated. So we have this on response. So now we can create the effect, the actual effect that will execute this fetch JSON data and connect it with the state. So I'll just paste it and explain it. It's called loader. It's an array. And this is the word we want to search for once we enter it here. So we are using this function. And the second argument here is which will be passed as options. We are passing URL, which we are expecting here, which is the URL I gave you. And then on response, we will be executing this action we created over here, which just normalizes the data. So it transforms it from array to a hash once again. And now this loader must be executed somewhere. For example, we can execute it at the beginning of our application. So instead of using a hash, we will be using an array here, like that, and we will remove that part because we no longer need it. Just to make it clearer, we will just format it differently. So now the first argument of the array is the state, and the second argument is the effect that should happen. So we will just invoke the query with the empty string so that we fetch all the projects. So once we invoke that, we will use this fetch JSON, we will get that data, and that will invoke got projects, because once we have this function should be executed with the data we received. And then it will be merged into this init. So let's see, I refresh, it doesn't work. And the problem is that in our project content, we are accessing certain elements that don't exist now. So we need to just check for that. So instead of destructuring, I will just use props here, and I will just check if props exist. And if they exist, I will access them. Otherwise, I will return empty array. And it works. Now I can change and it fetches the data. So now it would be nice to finish off by doing it just by searching through that. So if I, for example, type the word building, which is being highlighted, if I press the button, we should be able to filter the list. So that's now pretty simple. We just need to connect with the stop editing filter, which is the action that happens when we confirm our query, and we need to invoke an effect the same way as we invoke an effect when the app initializes. So we just invoke the loader. So here is the same. So instead of using and returning a hash, we will be returning array. And the first element is the actual action, and the second element is the loader, the effect. We will get the filter from the state. So now if I refresh, and if I say, for example, building, and if I press enter, the list is shorter. So let's say Kretes, Svelte, it works. So yeah, that was, I imagine not everything is clear. I just wanted to share it with you, show you how you can build this application using Hyperapp. I'm pretty excited about this framework. It's extremely small, it's 1 kilobyte, and you can do so much with that. It's very similar to React. And so if you know React or Vue, I think you will feel, many things will feel familiar. Yet we are just using the JavaScript and data structures, regular data structures such as array and objects to compose our application. So yeah, that's all for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.